All right, so I wanted to welcome both the membership and the members of the public for attending our December 17th meeting of the District-Wide Boundary Review Advisory Committee. I'm just going to quickly walk through the agenda, which is, after tonight's opening, we're going to do public comment. And I know we've got a number of members of the public that want to offer testimony tonight. So Jim is going to explain the ground rules for managing that part of the item for this evening. After that, we have two substantive agenda items for discussion tonight. One is a clarification and guidance for the committee on how do we develop our deliverable and the time frame. These were a couple of items that were sent, at least I think, an email yesterday or the day before. And then Judy, Sarah, and staff are going to provide some information and clarification on scenario modeling in response to the requests that we had posed to them last week. And then with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Jacks to facilitate public comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Trombley. We've got a lot more people than normal to make public comment. And so we're going to change the rules slightly from what we've done before, if you've been here before. Basically, I'll call your name, come up, say your name and I'm Jim Jacks. I work for Portland State University. I'm the facilitator for D-BRAC. So when I call your name up, come to the microphone, your name, your organization, or the school you're talking about. If you have handouts, give them to me and I can get them circulated to D-BRAC members. The meeting's being recorded. We have a professional note taker, so what you say, it becomes part of the D-BRAC record. Anything you hand in does as well. If you want to provide written comments, we have green cards, and you can write on those and turn them in at any point during the meeting. And normally we do 2 minutes for public comment, but we have way more people than that, so we're going to do 1 minute for public comment, and 1 minute goes really, really, really fast. So what'll happen when you have 30 seconds left, I'll be here like this, I'll wave the yellow card, and then when I stand up, that is your cue to stop. And if you can keep to the 1 minute time, that ensures more people are able to share their opinion. So and what I'll do is I'll call a name, and then I'll also call a second name so that you know who's next. So at this point, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name, Enrique Arias, and then Gabriel Mercedes Bolivar.
Okay, my name is Enrique Arias, and I'm representing Bridger School, and thanks for the hard work, but I'm just going to get to the questions. So we have a few questions about the newest proposal. Question one is, can you cite research that shows that heavy crowding or overcrowding is a recipe for success in high-poverty schools with racially diverse communities? The newest proposal is creating larger socioeconomic and racial inequities amongst our schools, especially on the east side. According to your forecast projections, the most impoverished and racially diverse communities are feeding into the most crowded schools like George and Harrison Park. The wealthier communities, on the other hand, are in the least crowded schools like Beverly Cleary, Mount Tabor, and Selwood. We also want the board to know that we did notice that Sunnyside Elementary still remains unchanged. And why is that? Have you considered moving the Japanese program? Richmond Elementary, the elephant in the neighborhood, is a poke in the eye when it comes to equity, and it has clearly received a lot of discussion in the meetings throughout Southeast Portland. The Japanese program draws traffic from all over Portland to a high-density neighborhood and displaces the kids who live right across the street. We would be interested to see a proposal where Richmond is moved either to a large school with a co-located neighborhood program, or perhaps somewhere like Harrison Park, where drivers can just come off 205 and get to the school. Thanks.
Thank you. So Gabrielle Mercedes Bolivar, and then after her is Jamie Kale.
My name is Gabrielle Mercedes Bolivar, and thank you. My husband and I are both PPS alumni, and we have 3 children in PPS with 2 middle school students at the Ockley Green 4-8 campus and a first grader at the Chief Joseph K3 campus. Our family loves our school, and even so, we embrace the changes to an Ockley Green Middle School and Harriet Tubman Middle School to provide all students with access to full and robust programming. The schools in North, and Northity, as we're now called, have historically bared the brunt of PPS changes that have resulted in increasing inequities in our district, and yet we are putting our trust in you to get this right this time. We have no time left to wait. Every day, our middle school students arrive in schools that do not have the adequate resources to provide an equitable access to a free, appropriate public education. While D-BRAC continues to work towards balancing enrollment, I ask that you keep applying an equity lens to the work you are doing. In 2011, the PPS Board of Directors passed the Racial Educational Equity Policy. I have selected a few key paragraphs from this policy. In order to achieve racial equity for our students, the board establishes the following goals. The district shall provide every student with equitable access to high quality and culturally relevant instruction, curriculum, support, facilities, and other educational resources, even when this means differentiating resources to accomplish this goal. Last night, we lost a friend, advocate, and a fiercely loyal warrior championing equity for all of our kids. Neely has inspired me to keep her light shining on achieving this goal for all of our students. Let's not lose any more champions while we continue to wait for the changes in PPS that will finally provide every student with equitable access to high quality and culturally relevant instruction, curriculum, support, facilities, and other educational resources, even when this means differentiating resources to accomplish this goal. And please remember, this includes our special education students. Thank you all for the work you're doing.
Thank you. Jamie Kale, and then it's Claudia Strong.
Hi, I'm Jamie Kale from King Elementary, also PPS graduate. Highland Elementary, King Elementary, Boise, Humboldt, Chief Joseph, Woodlawn, Ockley Green, Jefferson. All schools who have experienced significant change, trauma, displacement. Also, all schools who've graduated scholars, athletes, musicians, doctors, and teachers. This is despite those traumatic changes. This is despite the inequality of lackluster educations, policies, and sometimes even their schools closing. Our students have risen to the occasion. They have persevered. They have even prospered. But when do we stop making our Jefferson cluster students fight for every morsel they get? Fighting for quality electives, fighting for building spaces, fighting to just stay together as a community. Now. Now is the time. Now is the time to recognize the years of inequality, years of trauma, years of displacement. We need to keep our community strong, and breaking apart a school and dispersing kids to other schools while also disrupting them is not the way to provide equality to a most deserving population, nor is shutting down a beloved and longstanding pre-K program at King. King has a wonderful Mandarin immersion program. It has given dozens of Black and brown students an opportunity to become bilingual scholars. These students were promised the opportunity to learn Mandarin at King and continue their bilingual education all the way to Jefferson High School. Don't break yet another promise to these kids by taking away their Mandarin program or moving it away from King. Harriet Tubman Middle School is a wonderful opportunity to give Jefferson Cluster students a comprehensive middle school. Students can attend this great school and have a chance at quality electives, bilingual education, and a chance to become scholars ready for high school. Our students, who are also your students, deserve the best. Let's reopen this amazing school and start righting the wrongs that have been thrown at our students for years. Jefferson United and King School Strong.
Thank you. Claudia Strong, and then Roy Siegel.
Good evening. It's Claudia Strang, but I appreciate the strong. Thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of my daughter, Emma, who is in 2nd grade. So this is what she wrote. Hi, my name is Emma. I'm in the Mandarin Immersion program at King School. When I started in kindergarten, I had lots of friends at King. They are my neighbors. If you close King, then we will be split up and I won't be able to play with my friends at recess and after school. At my King playground where I played since I was a baby. I don't want to go to Boise, and if I do, I won't be able to walk to school if I'm early. I think this idea will hurt my feelings. I don't want this switch to happen. Please don't close King School. Thank you. Gracias. Shese.
Thank you, Roy Siegel.
I'm Roy Siegel. We have 2 kids, one in Lincoln and one in Skyline Middle School. In November, we saw 2 proposals, one for Skyline K-8 and one for Sylvan Middle School. On December 5th and 10th, Skyline was discussed, but there were some issues. Skyline remaining as K-8 school is listed but not modeled. A comparison of travel distances was inaccurate. And meanwhile, a new concept was introduced to consider transporting our kids across the St. John's Bridge to North Portland for racial and socioeconomic metrics. With 1 full minute, I'd like to present this chart, which hopefully you're seeing, and I'm going to cover column 1 is the school in our local community. Skyline is in our local community. It's our closest option. Sylvan's not as close, but it's still in Northwest. North Portland would transport our kids over the St. John's Bridge. Would we consider busing our kids from southwest to southeast over the river? Second column, we need to be able to get to our kids daily and in emergencies. Imagine your child is sick or injured, or there's a big emergency like we've seen rail fires, mudslides, or a big earthquake. Skyline is the closest and gives us multiple routes. Sylvan also has multiple routes. The St. John's Bridge can be full of traffic or closed completely. Finally, the fourth column, Skyline's an IB school, and this is important to our community. We'd like to hear IB in the Skyline K-8 dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Emily Lynn, and then Kelly Lycra.
My name is Emily Lynn, and I'm a Laurelhurst parent in support of Laurelhurst, Beverly Cleary, and Irvington staying K-8. This is easily accomplished without interfering or requiring other changes to other schools, and we brought a map today to show you that. District data shows a hypothetical sustainable K-8 with 500 students in 2 sections of around 50 students per class in the middle grades. We know your committee has suggested that Beverly Cleary doesn't have enough students to sustain a K-8. But in fact, in scenario 3, Beverly Cleary remains a K-8 and could remain a K-8 with 676 students. Even when part of our enrollment shifts to Rose City Park, all 3 schools have at least 50 students per grade in grades 6 to 8, and Beverly Cleary and Laurelhurst have closer to 75. These 3 schools also have 96% stability indices, which should be reassuring if there is a concern for enrollment fluctuations. Now we have some questions for you and PPS staff. Question: the district's optimal building size data indicates that a sustainable middle school requires 675 students and 33 classrooms. What data is the committee relying on to conclude that a middle school at Beverly Cleary Fernwood is sustainable with enrollment of only 450 students, 62% utilization, and only 26 classrooms? 62% utilization is 10% below any other middle school. Question: how is expanding Laurelhurst's enrollment boundary and creating a 2-campus elementary school in different neighborhoods a more cost-effective solution to what we are doing now? Question: given all the cost and disruption that will result from our 3 schools shifting to K-5, and given the broad community support of these schools to remain K-8, and given that switching configurations does not benefit other schools in need, what is the rationale for switching us to K-5?
Thank you. So for some of you that are feeling rushed speaking, I've noticed that's been the case for many of you. If you were reading from something, go ahead and email that to the committee. So
Okay.
please.
Hi, my name is Kelly Lightham, and I'm speaking for Abernathy. Right now, Highway 26 is one of the most dangerous roads in the area. ODOT even calls it a high crash corridor, which only is 3% of the roads, but 51% of pedestrian accidents and 38% of traffic fatalities. Your plan will move children from Abernathy and crossing 26 to Creston. This does not make sense, as Creston is not overfilled at this point, and Abernathy is not over-enrolled either. The Creston numbers were originally saying there's 18 classrooms in the school, but there's 18 and you thought there was 27. Those other classrooms are completely separate annex and are used for Head Start and the Deaf School program. I can't imagine you want to move those 2 groups to a different location. Also with Abernathy, you're going to be moving kids that are both walkers to their middle and high schools, and that means you have to pay to bus these children to Kellogg, which will be overcrowded, and to a different high school. And that is bringing money out of the classrooms and to move children when they could just walk to their schools. You could reopen Sunnyside if you're worried about not having enough space on the southeast side as a K-5. Right now, Mount Tabor is going to be one of the lowest numbers of students in a middle school, and you could put their middle schoolers from Sunnyside into Mount Tabor. You also could reopen Richmond as a neighborhood program. You could even keep the Japanese program as 2 strands and make 2 strands into the neighborhood school. That would increase the amount of native speakers from 4% in the Japanese immersion to a more concentrated number that would at least make it statistically proportional to other schools in the area. The last question is, why are we doing this? It's not safe to our children to cross the roads, and it's not helping our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Kent, and then Chris Bruce-Easy.
Okay, great. Hi, Heather Kent from Access PTA, President. I think you know, but it bears repeating that Access is not a focus option school, which implies choice, but a special alternative education for highly intellectually gifted students whose needs are not being met in their neighborhood schools. Intellectual giftedness transcends both race and class, and the parents of Access have been working with the school administration, tag office, and community leaders to increase diversity in our school. More equitable testing, consistent notification, outreach to neighborhood school tag specialists are all steps we've taken to make Access more diverse, and our demographics are changing. There are still more than 170 gifted students, qualified students on the waiting list for Access. We continue to need room for more students, and with the enrollment growing, Access needs to grow as well. Access also needs a location that is roughly equidistant to all 5 quadrants of the city. Currently, we have students enrolled from 54 different neighborhood schools. While we have not advocated for a specific location, we do need a central location, and that is our highest priority. I've sent D-BRAC some information about the locations proposed and the relative drive time. We've done some analysis on that and continue to support a strong central access.
Thank you. Chris Abruzzese.
Abruzzese. My name is Chris Abruzzese. I have 3 kids at Beverly Cleary School. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to provide feedback to the committee tonight. Last week, there was D-BRAC support for Scott Bailey's request that PPS build a revised version of the working model that preserves the K-8 configuration for BCS, Irvington, and Laurelhurst. We have taken the liberty to model that out, and Jed is handing out a map to show what that looks like and what the KPIs associated with it are. Our proposal uses the same overall boundaries for our 3 schools from last week's model and places into those boundaries PPS's Scenario 2 proposal for those 3 schools. It's important to note that nothing we are proposing changes what happens to other schools in the new working model. PPS has repeatedly assured us that both scenarios create self-sustaining schools. There are no non-formula FTEs involved in this, additional FTEs. According to PPS, the proposal also relieves overcrowding at our schools, which, as you know, is the major issue in the cluster. Other key observations: last week's working proposal reassigns 1,170 students across our 3 schools. Our proposal reduces reassignments to just 277 total. It also has a dramatic difference in the school to home distance between the 2. Like some of you, we question the feasibility of a 450 student middle school at Fernwood and its ability to offer robust middle school programming. And you've heard opposition to Laurelhurst 2 campus K-5 with the Hollywood building more than a mile away across a congested urban area. Occam's logic, also known as Occam's razor, states that if you have 2 equally likely solutions to a problem, the simplest is the most likely to succeed. We know Scenario 2 works. PPS has said it can work. Scenarios 1 and 3 look more like what is known as Occam's duct tape. They avoid simplicity. They multiply entities beyond necessity, and they make as many unnecessary assumptions as possible when considering the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're a couple minutes over on time. I apologize if you were not able to speak tonight. I encourage you to submit written comments either via email or letter. I know the committee spends a lot of time going through public comments. So if you have written comments, please submit those. And if you have any handouts you'd like me to give to the group, I can arrange that. So at this point, I should turn it back to Chairman Trombley.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. So the next item that we're going to talk through is kind of what our deliverable and a proposed time frame in order to meet that deliverable. So one of the things that we've known for a while is that, we have been debating a number of issues in addition to boundary changes, grade reconfiguration, potential move of program focus options and alternative programs. So we're kind of in the stretch now of trying to figure out how far in that decision can we get and how do we land this in a reasonable time frame given the other factors and conditions at play that inform how the superintendent will ultimately develop a recommendation that will then go to the board for the board's chance to do its public process. So to kind of provide some guidance and to shed some additional context on that, I wanted to turn it over to Superintendent Smith, who will give us some remarks.
Thanks, Jason. So I think, first of all, I just want to say I have been listening to at different chapters of your work together. I probably went to 12 of your 15, 17 listening sessions, and then your Saturday work session, and your one of your work sessions here where you were applying the equity lens. And I am totally impressed with how you've spent time educating yourself, and you now are the most knowledgeable people in the district in terms of both the data, the trends over time, the listening to the community, and wrestling with all the complexities of how are we accomplishing this task. So I just want to say, appreciate the depth of work that you've taken on here. And one of the most important things, I think, has been listening to you wrestle with those complexities, and it's not simple. And when on Saturday in the morning, when I was the Saturday work session in the morning, when like you go through narrowing and kind of looking like you're heading towards something, and then blasting it all apart again and coming back out again, and then narrowing. And I'm just going to say, I think both of those things are really important, and sitting with what you think may be a decision and then recognizing where, okay, this is where I don't feel comfortable. So I feel like we're in a normal stage of a process of something this complex. So what the modeling that you asked for coming out of that Saturday work session, where it looked like you were heading towards a primary grade configuration of K-5 going to middle schools, with some conversation about where do we hold on to K-8s. What I felt compelled to come and say, okay, what's helpful to me at this point as you're wrestling with, okay, what's your work product for the end of January? And to say to you, if in fact we're looking at that level of grade reconfiguration, what I would want to know as I'm heading into a budget process is that is the primary thing, one of the primary things you're looking at doing, because what that then does back to me is, okay, a prioritization and a sequencing, and then what does it take to actually do the planning, and what do I need to budget for planning processes, and what does it mean in terms of costs of facility, which will mean I would probably be looking at starting any of that process no earlier than 2017. So I just wanted to say that to you right now. And again, I'm giving you this as just my raw thinking, having listened to where you were. You can come back to me with whatever you come back to me with, but what it would take and what kind of domino effect would be, I would imagine wanting that time to be able to do community planning processes, to say, here's the program for the for the K-5 and middle school, and engage the community in that, and do whatever kind of facility adjustments we needed to do, and plan for how we pay for that. So that just puts a time, and then I imagine it would take time, not like it's all going to happen in one fell swoop in 2017. So that's one just frame in my head of what's useful coming back to me. If in fact you end up with schools that you are wanting to recommend stay K-8, and I'm hearing some of that discussion, then just hearing the rationale of why and understanding how you got to that recommendation, and do we have then the workability of the K-5 middle that actually makes the K-5 and middle configuration work. So I need that the ecology of that whole mix works. So I would want to hear that back from you. I would say also probably I heard other conversations about when you were looking at Southeast, where boundaries were currently running north-south, we want to try them east-west or vice versa. Those kinds of things, really valuable. You don't need to apply them and get all the way to having done it and drawn the boundaries, but saying, here's what our thought was and here's how we were able to respect major transportation routes. Say that so that we've got that guidance. Anything that you've discovered that are those kinds of guidance back, great. Otherwise, you can do kind of high level, here are feeder patterns that would work, or schools that we would use and feeder patterns we would work. So in terms of thinking of what level of specificity to get a product, keep you guys operating in the feeder pattern, and here's where we can get to healthy size schools, and then let us work on, okay, how do we actually apply the things that you're giving guidance on? And then I think finally what's useful is you guys having some conversation about after this moment in January where you give me back what you give me, what kind of ongoing role do you want, if any? Okay, and that may be all of you, some of you. So, period. Just final question for you to be able to think about. And there may be more things, but those are the ones that come into my head having listened to you. And just finally, I just want to say appreciation in huge amount for having taken this on and being willing to really engage and understand the complexity of this and listen to all of what you've heard from the community, which makes it more complicated, not less, because you're really trying to figure out how you land a lot of different interests that don't come together into a simple answer. So just thank you for being willing to wrestle with this. And I think that's probably my guidance back to you as you're figuring out what's the work product you actually deliver.
So for members, why don't we do 5 minutes of clarifying questions for the superintendent? So I'm going to let Jim facilitate who's in the speaking order.
Hi. Did I hear you say that you would not be doing any implementation until 2017?
If what you're talking about is, I'm saying if what you're talking about is major grade reconfiguration to K-5s and middles, in my head right now, I would probably look at that start being in 2017 because I would want to be able to do what are the facility modifications we need to do in order to put a middle school somewhere, what's the on-ramp planning in order to be able, you guys have expressed huge, what is the big concern? It's can we implement with integrity, right? So if in fact we know that now, our ability to do the staffing considerations, the planning considerations, the curriculum considerations, the facility that all requires money and planning. So I would want to be able to leave the time for the planning on-ramp and getting the facilities ready. And again, you may come back to me with one that has high urgency, that you say, great, we accept that, but here's a place that we have high urgency, and you may make a different, I'm just telling you, from me listening to you, that's where my head goes. And as I'm heading into budget, I need to be able to know, here's what I need to budget for. I need to budget for planning processes. I need to budget for getting X building ready to be something different than what it currently is. Does that make sense? Yeah, but I'm not doing a hard and fast. I'm really just trying to feed you back, having listened to you and where I think you're headed. I don't know that you've landed yet, so I'm just telling you, in which case, if we're talking 2017 implementation, it gives a different frame on what you need to get specific about right now and where you can stay, like here's the direction we're headed, and buys a little, anyway.
So, location of focus options. To me, it's a big piece, and it's sort of a hands-off because we don't have the analysis done. And
So I'm actually going to let
what are
you
we
guys.
Supposed to do with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to let Sarah do a little bit because you're doing some specific work on this, I believe, in January, and I'm going to say, like, you may also have specific thinking on it, and I would say communicate that, but you're getting some more of the specifics in January.
Yeah, so great question, and this is obviously a key part of the equation. Just as a clarification, I think some people have asked, why haven't they been on the table to begin with? We wanted to focus first on neighborhood schools. I think it was clear from Sackett's recommendation, neighborhood schools are sort of the bedrock. We want to get those strong first, but obviously focus options are an important part of the equation. So what we are working on, and you will have prior to January 9th, is some additional analysis on focus options, and specifically that analysis is going to be scoped or kind of focused on are there situations where focus option schools are contributing to under-enrollment at neighborhood schools? Are there situations where rethinking the locations of focus option schools would help to alleviate overcrowding? So we're gonna give you that piece of information by January 9th, and I'd be curious to see how you react to that. And again, per Superintendent Smith, if you have more guidance, we will obviously incorporate that and take that into account. We also have a focus option review committee underway, and they are looking at some other questions that are relevant to enrollment balancing, but they're just relevant in general. So, and that work is going to just continue throughout the year, to be honest. So there's things like we hear like focus options. What is their what's their fundamental purpose? And actually, it's an educational options review, so the scope's a little bit wider, so it would include alternatives. So this is why some of this takes a little bit of time. And we look at things like, are there certain requirements that focus options schools should be exempt from, like the core program? And if so, why? And so there's some larger questions at stake as well. But for the purposes of and we're not going to have all that to you right now, but for the purposes of January 9th, what I can tell you is we're working on like kind of a specific analysis that we think will help with the location question.
So about maybe another 1 or 2 minutes, so.
We've talked about immersion quite a bit, and to me, it's still pretty unclear. I don't really understand how the optimization of the future of immersion plays into the neighborhood situation, because if we're going to be moving and clustering immersion and doing some of those things, we need to think about the interplay between the immersion programs and the neighborhood programs and how that affects socioeconomics of the school buildings, because sometimes we're not seeing that. And I just think that it's still sort of a mystery to me. I don't have enough background or understanding of how those things play into each other, so that might be another thing that we could get more information on then.
Yes.
Thanks. When I got selected to serve on this committee, one of the main thing that interests me was equity in education. After all, PPS teaches and educates our children. And so when I sat around the table and first heard different ones represent certain schools as bad schools, that really troubled me, because I knew that those schools were schools primarily in areas where minority households and minority family and children lived. And I wondered, why there was no interest in doing something about bad schools, as they call it. And so while I listened to all of the different concerns that the parents and different ones have about the schools, distances from the school, safety, which is very important, a number of other issues. None of them really have any relationship to the education of their children. It just is sort of like a convenience or inconvenience or unfairness. I would like to see this committee continue and this community focus on a greater good, and that at the end of the day, when we leave here, what we have is schools that are quality schools no matter where they're situated, and that all of our children get a good education. And right now, I know that that's not happening in my community, so that's going to continue to be my focus.
And actually, Maxine, I'm just going to say, and that is the goal of this entire process, so thank you for articulating that. And you guys, thank you for your work. Good luck figuring out where this goes in the next month here. I'm really eager to get what I get from you, and it may still be, like, as I say, like, what I really want is we end up feeling really good about where we land with this. So, yeah, I mean, we get to where we get to in January, and there may be continued stuff that we have to keep doing. So I understand that as well.
Jason.
All right, Superintendent Smith, thank you very much. All right, so moving on to our first substantive agenda item, which is all in your packet. It's talking about the deliverable and our time frame discussion. So, following on Superintendent Smith's remarks for the evening, I met with staff last week to figure out, if this is the direction that we're heading, that this is technically like the last officially scheduled meeting of the year, and we clearly still have some work to get done. And I think also in particular from the email conversations that happened over the course of the weekend, and I want to thank Michael for kicking that off, because I think that was a really essential frame to us to figure out how do we land this in a place that is not only reflective and responsive of what the community has told us, but helps us get in a place of where we feel confident in handing something over to the superintendent that's been well vetted to the best of our ability. So I'm going to walk through what I think is a framework of how we get there. And so what I'm hoping for tonight, for the first hour of this discussion, is going to be, given this approach, what do we need staff to help get us so we can get there in a place that's feasible for all of us? Okay, so again, what Superintendent Smith has indicated to us is that there's this idea of, and this is what I sent out an email, this idea of, in addition to our meeting tonight, that we would continue work over the course of 3 meetings, which would hopefully conclude by January 22nd, knowing that come January 22nd, we would officially transmit some kind of official recommendation package to the superintendent. And so within that, so there are a couple of things that we could consider just as a starting point. So one of the things we would need to figure out is consideration of ideas of what we'd want to include in that deliverable, and one things that we just can't leave out or we just can't come to consensus on, and we would note that. And then the next part of this, like, given that time frame or that framework, we'd have to figure out what's the schedule for us to actually get there. So one thing that's also come up in a number of cases is, and I think I saw this personally at the meeting last week, which was we're doing this back and forth of, there are schools we want to look at and schools that we want to try to way to solve the problems that are currently in place, or hopefully prevent the ones that we think are going to come if we don't put some kind of change in place. But what's also happening is we're doing some things that are location specific and not thinking about the whole system. And so I personally have looked at this as a bookend perspective of, on one end, you've got kind of the guiding, advice statements that would govern how you do certain implementation across the system. And then on one hand, it's school specific for 85, all schools in the system. So it's this balance of, are you doing the holistic approach or kind of deep down school by school? So for me, the question is, how do we balance that? And so I wanted to go back to the language that we put in our meeting on September 17th, where we voted to say how far into this process that we wanted to go collectively, because I think that actually reflects that bookend of where we want it to be. So on the 17th, this is the statement that the majority of the committee, adopted, which was that we would provide feedback on how each scenario aligns with the values framework that we endorsed, submitted to the superintendent, and was adopted by the board on all elements of public enrollment balancing scenarios, and recommend a subset, specific scenario components, to the superintendent. So that's that high-level approach of the guiding values, or kind of the rules for how you design the final map, and how does that apply to specific schools. So we voted, ideally, that's where we wanted to be with our final recommendation package. In addition to that, we also did, when we called for a vote, the majority also said, if we couldn't achieve that specific level, school-specific recommendation, we also said that we would be okay with providing feedback on how each scenario aligns with the values framework on all elements of the system. So we would step back and say, and just provide guidance on, here's how scenario 1 does that, here's how it doesn't, here's what the same thing for scenario 2, and provide amendments on how to potentially guide staff in terms of applying our framework and policies to meet that, to develop the final scenario. So we consciously voted to give ourselves some amount of wiggle room, but what I've seen is we haven't figured out how to land which way. So within that, there are a couple of things, based on a number of the dialogue and discussions that we've had, some things that have, come up in terms of how do we land this? What are the components to getting there? And so the first one is a recommendation per the superintendent's discussion on the degree of the grade reconfiguration. So one of the things that I felt was important that we've got to, hopefully be able to get to is, if in fact we're in agreement with what we considered at our Saturday session, if we're going to revert back to a school that is primarily elementary and middle school, given the number of buildings at play, because there are, I think, 29 K-8s in the system, that we would want to come up with what is our rationale for saying, if it's all schools, why? But if you're going to look at some schools, what is your checklist or criteria that says which schools? So that the community knows across the board why their school is being identified or not. And that was one of the things we said in our framework was a concern, was that schools experienced change or went through change without a reason why. So we want to make sure that we're giving reasons for the entire community why. And second, with this question on maintaining K-8s, that if we're going to say we want some K-8s to stay, we can't just exclusively name them. It's giving a clear process for why those K-8s are going to remain as opposed to others. Part 2 of this is boundary changes in communities where we're not addressing K-8. So we've got a number of communities, in particular on the west side, where there's only one current K-8, but there are a lot of issues around overcrowding and under-enrollment. So the question is, how do we alleviate some of those over-enrollment issues on the west side through boundary change? So the question is, what kind of specifics can we get to on that? Particularly the testimony that we've heard from communities over there saying that there's a lot of changes that we'd like to see or consider, or at least bring us some changes that will actually solve the issues we're dealing with. And then part 3, which is another component to this, is a process for, and suggestions for arriving at additional recommendations. So if we go back to, if we recommend a middle school, a K-5 middle school model, what is the feasibility of, opening some middle schools up? One of the scenarios is Kellogg. What is that going to look like? How specific of guidance do you want to give in terms of actually drawing school boundaries? And to the point that Scott raised during the Q&A of, in particular what we're going to see in January, is what is it that you actually want to do, in fact, about focus options and alternative programs? And in particular, what is your criteria for moving them, and demonstrate what is it you're trying to achieve by that move. So it's clearly demonstrated so the community knows what our logic is in that particular move. And so lastly, so knowing that these tensions are at play, but also knowing that as much as the community has weighed in and given us feedback, we also have to find a way to actually land a clear recommendation package, because the community has been looking at this for a number of months, as have we, but they're now looking to us to figure out, based on what we've heard, what do we actually want to do with all of the information we have gotten to date. So knowing that, this is the schedule that I worked with staff to throw out there for discussion, that I think we can address all of those issues that we've just walked through. So the first step is at our work session, which would be proposed for Saturday, January 9th, that we would see, there were a lot of modeling questions that we raised last week, and staff are going to walk through those later on in the meeting. Really get some clarity around where do we want to head on that real question of, K-8s versus elementary, middle schools. Which model do we want to go through? Apply for the district going forward, and all of the other questions that I've raised. To really nail in a number of those specifics. So it's, on one hand, it's the guiding rules for how you determine which building is which, or if you want to get to the rules plus name the buildings, you can. Then if we can nail a number of those decisions, then what we would turn around and do on Thursday, January 14th, is that what was discussed on that Saturday work session is we'd come back at a normal work meeting, and that what we'd hopefully have developed is a digest of everything that was proposed, and that would get circulated through Google Docs or some manner so that members could get a first look at it, and then in a work session figure out, do we still agree with where we landed on the 14th? Say that the language is good, what amendments do we need to have, and move that forward. And then hopefully, if we can, on Wednesday, January 20th, that we'd come back for one final work session, and then if we are able to, finalize and hopefully vote on those recommendations. So this is the work plan in response to the Superintendent Smith's discussion just a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to put that out for discussion. And so for me, the primary question that I will throw to the group is, knowing this particular timeline and what the superintendent has given to us a few minutes ago, what do members need collectively to actually meet what I've just talked about? And I'm going to turn over Jim to facilitate this.
Any thoughts on more information that you need that you don't have now?
Well, just as I read through can you go back one slide? So this is really the heart of the matter, that we're supposed to have enough information to make decisions around. And the first one is related to the KPIs, correct? Is that, when we say criteria here, is that the kind of thing we're talking about, plus maybe crossing safe routes and the like? Is that the idea? That's a question. I guess I have the mic. The second one I understand. And the third one, just most specifically on the focus option locations, there's a lot of guidance. It's just like Scott was saying on how to think about focus options and how they fit into the whole system that, personally, I don't think I have right now.
While you're changing, can I just make a point of clarification, and maybe this would just help Jason for me. So when I'm reading that third bullet, it's not, it's about process suggestions, like how, or should PPS, this body, anybody else, arrive at the next level of decisions? Not what are the answers, but how do we get there? If we haven't been able to get there by January, what do you think as a body who's been working so hard at this for so long about what it takes to get there? Is that fair reading?
I'm looking for two things. One is, as we discussed and coming out of that all-day work session, a baseline scenario where essentially everything is K-5 middle school. And then for the special cases where different communities have said we think a K-8 would work better here for one reason or another, some kind of comparison of pros and cons of, what do you get by staying with as a K-8, and what are the trade-offs? What would you get by going to a K-5 middle? What are the trade-offs for those? I think there's 6 or 8 right now under consideration as special cases that would remain different from what would be our standard, which would be a K-5 middle school model.
I am interested in knowing whether or not other people are interested in knowing about the costs of the process, because I know in that Hanford research piece that you recently had done, that there is a list of things that we should know, and cost is one of them. And I thought we were going to know something about that earlier, but when is that? I would think it might be useful. I don't know what other people think about that. The costs of implementing the changes that we're proposing.
Everything that's been proposed so far?
Well, there maybe is it cheaper to not convert as many schools? I would think it might be. Is that an important, do we have the money to? I know that we don't have an unlimited budget. Yeah, so I don't know, what is it that the best practices suggest from that piece of work that you gave us? I imagine there's a pretty clear definition of what costs is.
So Jason and then Joe.
So I think one of the things that I would be interested in, I think, as a process point under number 3, and I particularly look at focus options, and I also will include, alternative programs. I listened thoughtfully to the testimony given by staff from Sunnyside who want us to think that we can do something with their program. But I also think about, the reality of other program moves, like, do we have to really put on the table moving MLC to help alleviate the overcrowding at Chapman? For me, the question is, in policy, there's, questions on, if you're looking at focus options, do they still exist? Are you going to move one, or will you expand one? Or in some circumstance, programs that will, in fact, be shut down? I mean, for me, I don't feel, to be in the position if you're going to keep a program open or shut it down. I just want to know which programs we're in fact working with. So it's like, what is the criteria using to, ensure that a program is in fact going to be viable? I'd also want to, in particular, look at when we're looking at focus option moves. I know we have data in terms of the current enrollment at focus options and from where they draw in terms of the actual neighborhood populations. but because of a number of the focus options, one thing that I haven't seen is what the actual applicant pool looks like. So I'd be curious of if we're going to move a program from, southeast to north, and I find out that there is a lot of interest from students in the north part of Portland that want to go to that focus option, am I creating an unanticipated consequence of further draining enrollment at a neighborhood school in North Portland? So I'm creating a new problem in north that happened to be in existence in southeast. So that information in terms of both acceptance rates into focus options as well as kind of the demographics of the student application pool of the focus options, at least for this year, to at least get a sense of, because I don't want to create more consequences if I can avoid them as best I can.
One thing that in this whole decision-making process, especially as we're getting towards the end, that I feel, for me, would like to revisit is what the solutions or what the approach that we're coming up with tells us about the acute issues we were asked way back at the get-go to jump on first. Because even as the PPS and the superintendent figure out the phasing of this, that was really one of the things that was an important thing to address quickly. So I haven't, I want to see what the scenarios that we've come up with mean for that and how it might be phased to be addressed. And then the idea of what the superintendent said about phasing in 2017, that's part of the reason why the acute thing is in my mind. But I got to say that I appreciate that kind of taking the time for a thoughtful approach, because one of the other premises that I carry is that we do not want to repeat the experience of the last time of doing this, of making a switch and having people have to go through, teachers, students, facilities, families. We're not prepared for changing from one level of school to another, right? And I think a lot about what we've heard is people have worked very hard to overcome that, and there's a commitment to seeing it through, and we don't want to repeat a version of that, right? And it's going to take some time to figure out how to phase it. So I appreciate her. But that's not to say that the change is not the right way to go, but I appreciate the willingness to plan for it.
So what I would like would be two scenarios that I feel good about moving forward that aren't going to be perfect, because nothing's going to be perfect, but I could feel good that either one of them is going to address why we got into this mess in the first place. The programming, the equity issues. What I need to do that, there are things that I really want that I'm not going to get. That's clear. And they're really important. So I know that, the district's working on focus. The focus option, what's the role of that educationally in the district? We're not going to have that. The district is starting to work on what's a middle school, middle grade program look like. We're not going to have that. That's a ways away. So there's some good things in motion that we're not going to have that I think are really important to the decision going forward. But I don't personally want to sign off on something that's sort of high level, go and do good things. We're supposed to be about boundaries. I'm in until we've got boundaries, or at least a couple of scenarios with boundaries.
Other thoughts?
No, Michelle.
This is sort of related. There was a survey that you put online. I think it was mostly online. And I'd like to see the results of the survey. And the rest of the, I guess you were going to maybe compile the meeting notes into some sort of synthesis spreadsheet. I thought I heard something about that. I'd like to get all of that as soon as possible, because I feel like it's hard to move on without having the public comment done.
And real quick, the focus option, and are you including alternative in terms of the movement and impact? And does focus option include immersion?
Yes, it includes immersion, and I am including alternatives such as MLC access. Yeah.
So maybe this could be something for January, and one of the things that I keep hearing from a number of families in K-8s, they've even through tough times, they've worked their heart outs to build good communities and raised funds to hire additional teachers to support those programs. And back to the modeling that you all did early on, where the enrollment ranges allow schools that, based on classroom size and numbers, that buildings are able to have the FT available to support the core offering without using the deeping into the other buckets to actually sustain the program offerings, or at least the core pieces of it. So one of the things that, I don't know if you can do it for all, but at least maybe one or two K-8s as a starting point, how does that, for January, when we're looking at a K-8 that we may convert, how does the math in fact play out? So like if I'm gonna look at, for example, I don't know, Sabin hypothetically, and I'm taking it as a K-8 and I'm gonna move it back to an elementary middle school. If that move in fact happens, how does that shift in terms of the enrollment numbers between the new elementary and the middle school? How do those numbers more or less demonstrate that you're in fact supporting the base level of offerings that the current K-8 at Sabin does? Because I think for me that's the one, I guess, numbers trade-off that I would make is how do you see the actual program evaluation that it's close to comparable? Then I feel like then I can go to families and say, yes, I'm voting for a predominantly elementary middle school, which is going to change your K-8, but at the very least I can look at them directly and say, at least the core of what you built is in fact going to be maintained through this move. That's just me.
I agree with that. Last week I asked about a question about the commitment to an equitable program that is attained at every school. And the answer I got was that, well, we're doing this and we're not, everybody will have the core programming guaranteed without using these other funds, like Jason just said. I think that my point was not so much that we have an equal access to the core, a core which I think is kind of minimal, but equitable access to opportunities in general across the board. And so I'm not sure how we, and I don't know if you're understanding what I'm saying, but just because everybody has equal access to a minimum core does not guarantee that we have equity. And so I need to see something that says a little bit more about what we're going to do about the variation from school to school. And if anybody doesn't understand what I'm saying, I would like to discuss that, because just saying, like John said, well, I've said 100 times that everybody's going to get access to the core without using foundation funds or whatever, that doesn't really, that's equality of a minimum standard. That's not, doesn't really address all the other variables. And I know we,
So staff just got asked if we're getting what we need and if there's something else that we would would ask of it, so I appreciate the question. I think that at this moment, so we have some work that we want to do with you for the second part of the meeting that I think will help us be able to better understand where you all are coming from. This is a difficult format to do the kinds of things that we would all love to do. Practice some mindful inquiry, be able to pause and say, tell me more about that. I think I heard you say this, but I'm not sure. I mean, there are 150 times every meeting I feel like I really want to do that, and they may be the same as Sarah's and they may be different, right? And you all are feeling the same way. So we don't always have time for that. We have an activity in a few minutes that we hope is going to help us get there. But before we turn to that, I guess I was mostly interested in knowing, like, are you on a page for like trying to do this level of focus? I heard Scott say I'm in it for boundaries. I'm concerned about the high level, and on those dates, you know, the way that we've got it mapped out right now, can you live with that as our plan for moving forward, which is a real sprint for the next level of work, more than just what additional information do you need? Because, like, you know how hard we're trying to get you the information you said you needed a while ago. So adding more to the list right now is maybe it's not more, maybe it's just clarifying which of those things are most important. But in addition to what we need to make great scenarios, which is really what we're going to talk about next, is this plan for working together in January. Does it sound doable? Does it sound like something you can live with? That's what I think we were hoping to hear. And I think what would be helpful is to hear your ideas for making it better. Not is it good or bad, not is it are you yellow or not, but what would make it better for the work that needs to get done for a delivery to the superintendent in time for her to put things into a budgeting cycle.
So Sasha hasn't spoken yet, so we'll go Sasha, Scott, Michelle.
So I'll take a first pass at the question that Judy asked, and for me, I think this is a good way to start narrowing where we need to go, because those seem to me to be high leverage answers. So for example, criteria for citing middle schools sets a domino chain of possible realities. I think it's a good place to go. Same for criteria for remaining K-8s. I think those get us further down the road in a relatively compact way.
I just want to say I don't know, because to me the bottleneck is the scenario turnaround time. And I don't know how that iteration is going to work out, whether we will have the time to run something and get this far, and then we want to try that, and then we want to try that, I don't know what the turnaround time is, so I don't know if the timeline makes sense.
So I apologize for being late, so I'm not sure if I'm jumping in the middle of something that may have already been said. So one of the things that I'm struggling with in these scenarios is trying to understand how this feeds to high schools, and that we are not explicitly looking at those at the same time. So it's hard for me to think about where to cite middle schools if I don't know where they're going to. So that would just be something that I know that was part of the conversation around, for example, Tubman and King, right? So if students, for example, from Vernon are going west and then being fed back to a school 10, 12 miles to the east, it's helpful to know what those patterns are and thinking about the movement of students.
So, yeah, and it's sort of what I asked before. On the first one, which is, I think, the first two are where the heart of the matter is for our charge, right? When we say criteria, I think, when I see that, I think it's more explaining the reasoning because criteria sounds like KPIs to me. And we look at KPIs and we use it to reason through, right? And use the equity lens. And it's almost like defining a scenario, but it's more of a like structure, like I keep saying. So I think we need to explain our reasoning for citing middle schools, which I think we can do. And we need to explain our reasoning for maintaining K-8s, and also tie it back to the criteria, the KPIs, because we're just making a recommendation and the district's going to use it. And so they'll go back to those criteria too, but it's more like explaining what we're thinking and tying it back to our principles and tying it to the evidence.
One of the things I was concerned about with respect to the framework that we used was that it was pretty vague, and so it really didn't give you strong guidance about how to pull the scenarios together. And we might be able to in this process, get a little bit more specific about those KPIs. For example, if we want to say that we want to balance socioeconomics across the schools, maybe we say we don't want to see any school with higher than a certain percentage of kids in poverty. I mean, that's just an example, but we might want to put some tighter boundaries around some of our standards.
Let's do the work, that's what I'm told.
So the example that I would add to what Sheila just said is, and it's in our original agreements, taking into account the history that got us to this point, and that if we choose to, so you gave one example, another example would be, in fact, we heard public comment about it tonight, to not impact a school that's been impacted over and over and over again, that we say, well, how do we decide that? What's the criteria for that? And the way Joe framed it also, explain why we're doing that.
All right, any other comments? Okay. All right, I'm going to now turn it over to Judy and Sarah.
Well, thank you, D-BRAC. It's really helpful to know that you have this plan, and what we'd like to do now is turn it to a discussion of that will help us as staff give you what you need in advance of January 9th, so you can really do your best work in that work session setting and then in the 2 subsequent meetings. So we are actually a little bit ahead of schedule, which is amazing. And so I would offer that we can take a 4-minute break, or we can just dive in and maybe even get ourselves out of here a little early. So 2-minute break, and let's get out of here a little bit early. And I'm actually going to start with a small piece of housekeeping that we didn't quite get to before. So in your packet are one set of draft meeting notes. They are from December 5th. They are lengthy, 6 pages long, and I don't think it's a good use of your time to sit and read together tonight. However, there are a lot of people keenly interested in this process, and they'd like us to get these they'd like to get them posted right away. So what I'm proposing is that we break from what our protocol has been and go ahead and post draft versions of the meeting minutes. They're draft, so that the people who can't, who don't have time to watch the whole thing can get a quick read on what's happening at your meetings. And then we will have an additional set from last week, from the 10th, and from tonight. I mean, we had 3 meetings in like 9 days. In that last, you probably are still trying to get over that, and we're still trying to catch up with all of the minutes from it. So my proposal to you is that we go ahead and post draft versions of the minutes, if you're comfortable with that, so that there's visibility on your work, and then you'll have those to approve officially at one of your meetings in January, okay? Thank you very, very much. So I'm going to drive, and Sarah's here to support. So we both have mics. We may go in harmony at some moment. We are here to ask for some clarification. As you know, you've generated many ideas, interesting ideas, huge ideas, pretty small and practical ideas, but there's a lot of ideas out there for new models and for things to improve the scenarios. And sometimes the language that comes with those, as I said earlier, we don't have a chance to go back and really check for meaning, not just the meaning for that one person, but is that meaning understood across the others? So we want to do a little bit of that with you tonight. And we're doing that so that we can give you back quality results that help drive towards a conclusion that you want. So another thing that's in your packet is a chart that describes the input that you gave us when you amended the model that we presented you on December 10th. Okay, so it's colorful. And I'm gonna say right now, with apologies, I was having problems. Excel kept crashing on me, and so we had to move it to another computer to print it. And the margins didn't get changed. It's all supposed to be on one side. The way it is, there's one on the other side, and that's the one that people didn't like as much. And now it makes it look like I was trying to just get rid of it. And I apologize for that because it was important. It's important for you to see these things all together. So you have that as a reference for part of what we're going to do tonight, so that we can get into some detail about what you asked for, and so we better understand how we can meet your needs. So there's two things that we're going to be looking for. First of all, did we get it right? Are we stating back to you accurately what you wanted us to do? And secondly, we need to know a little bit more about your desired outcomes for your request, especially if we're in places where there wasn't a specific rationale that came with it, or where it looks to us like there are requests that are in conflict. So you kind of asked us to do, in some ways, two things with the same school, and we just need to make sure we understand what you're trying to achieve in doing that. So the process that we want to go through is a walkthrough of those requests that are on that chart, and then when we're walking through them, we assume that we've got it right, that we've stated it accurately, unless you tell us otherwise. So we're not going to pause on everyone. We're just going to, if we got it wrong, please let us know now. If it seems right, then we're going to move on to the next thing, which is an activity around criteria. And Joe, I'm really, trying to think through that word and the meaning of it, and whether what we really mean is your rationale, why things are important to you. But we're going to give you a chance to do some of your own personal thinking at this moment in the process about some of these different kind of criteria that have emerged and where you stand, and then give you a chance to see where you stand compared to where your colleagues stand, and then invite discussion around what you see. And then during that discussion, we believe that a lot of the clarity that we're seeking on how to make these scenarios really fit your needs are going to come out. And if we're not hearing that, we may let you know at that time. So the real purpose of this is to get you into that discussion. So I'm going to move kind of quickly, and hope that sounds okay. Okay, so then the next thing that we're going to do is walk you through the suggestions that you made at your last meeting, which we acknowledge kind of went in a real brainstormy. It was a little wild for a little while, and it was a little hard for us to be sure of what we heard. So we appreciate the time that you're going to take to help us get back to that. Is there anyone here who wasn't here last week? Maybe Julie? Yeah. Okay, so now you're probably like, what did they do? Don't worry, you're going to know probably better than we will at the end of tonight what really happened, because you weren't in the chaos part. So what we did is we took our notes and we grouped your suggestions into some categories, and that's how they show on this chart. Okay? So the first category was that we noted that you asked us to model both greater and lesser degrees of the K grade reconfiguration. right? So you both asked for 2 middle schools in the Roosevelt cluster, which is more middle schools than what we've modeled to date. And you asked us to retain 7 schools as K-8s, which is more than we've retained in any of the scenarios so far, okay? It looks to us like creating more middle schools was of greater interest to members. And remember, you weren't voting on doing these things. You were just reflecting whether you were really interested in seeing those results than was creating more K-8s. So we just, yeah, okay. And during the exercise, really what we're keenly going to be listening for is what are the guiding criteria associated with creating more middle schools or creating more K-8s? Because we can model them either way. There are so many different possible outcomes that we would have to sift through. If you can give us better direction of what you're trying to get on the other side, then hopefully we can do a better job of giving you better results. Okay, so that's the first group, number 1. Group number 2 were changes in the North region, and this is largely the Roosevelt cluster. But because it moved into other areas, we call it the North region. Mostly it was about the Roosevelt cluster. You asked us to model 2 middle schools feeding into Roosevelt. You also asked us to keep Cesar Chavez as a K-8. Right there, that might be a little bit of a conflict because of the building sizes, just pointing that out. You asked us to model George feeders differently to reduce concentration of poverty. We appreciate that there was a rationale associated with that one. That's helpful to us when we're looking at the results we're getting. It looked like 2 middle schools and the George changes were of higher interest than maintaining Chavez as a K-8. Just confirming that. And I also wanted to mention, and maybe Sarah will jump in here really quickly, is that when you were having your discussion, something that people pointed out a couple of times was that there was a point on the slide that showed that we expected growth of about 20% in the coming 5 years in the George Middle School feeder pattern. Over the last week, staff has been working with preliminary results on updated neighborhood forecasts that we've gotten from the Center for Public Service, or keep doing that, Population Research Center, sorry Sheila. And it now looks like, in fact, it's probably less growth than what we said last week because enrollment has been lower in these 2 years since the last update. So
Yep, you said it. That's exactly right. So we'll have those new forecasts out to you very shortly. But we said 20% growth for George. It's not 20% growth.
And
it's less.
And we thought it was
There's
worth
still
mentioning
growth
tonight because it clearly was something like it was striking to people, and we're just trying to let you know that we didn't mean to alarm unnecessarily. We didn't want you to wait a whole long time and then go like, oh, well, why didn't you tell us that before? Okay? All right. So I'm going to move on to the Northeast region now. You asked us to model Tubman as a middle school with feeder K-5s that were based on proximity. Okay, again, appreciate having the rationale or the thing that you most wanted to achieve with that feeder pattern. I'm going to note that one of the 7 K-8s that was asked to maintain a K-8 was Irvington, and the one school that was used as an example of a school that might go into Tubman because of proximity was Irvington. So we can't do both things with Irvington. It would be helpful to know which one is most meaningful to you. I think we think we know, but if you can be as specific as you can, that would be helpful before we end tonight, or, yeah. You also asked us to model Vernon feeding Beaumont Middle School instead of Tubman or King, and we appreciate that. It would help to know the rationale behind that. What is it that you're hoping to achieve that goes with that feeder pattern? And if you have something specific, please let us know. So then, and then the other thing I would say with that is that we're often looking for parallel situations. So if it makes good sense there, might that same strategy make good sense somewhere else? What is it about that configuration and that need for change that we want to make sure we're addressing elsewhere? That's why it's helpful to know what it is you're trying to achieve. And then you also asked us to model Vietnamese immersion going to Clark instead of Vestal for K-5. And then the Vestal Neighborhood K-5 feeding Mount Tabor instead of Roseway Heights for middle school. Okay, so that was the other thing. And again, it was an idea, and helping to to understand the substance under that idea would be good. Okay, blowing through these. This is a lot of asks in a short period of time last week. Aaron wasn't here. He tried to watch the tape. Yes. So in the southeast region, so you asked us to model lane feeders differently to reduce concentrations of poverty. Appreciate that there was a rationale associated with that. One question that we had coming back, because we were kind of conflating it with your discussion from the meetings on at PSU on the 5th, was were you really just looking at lane, or were you trying to apply something more region-wide? So it'd be helpful to understand that. And again, is it something unique about Lane because it's a high poverty school right now, or is it something that you're trying to achieve wherever you can? You asked us to model Woodstock feeding Lane instead of Hosford, which is maybe just a really specific way to connect to that other thing. Maybe there was more to it than that. You asked us to model creative science, converting to a focus option neighborhood hybrid. And then I also attached on here, going back to that 12-5 meeting, where you asked us to model east-west boundaries that would go along major arterials, okay? And one thing that we haven't done all that work yet, at least I haven't. Oh no, did my slide not get in here? Oh no. Sorry. Oh, there's my slide. I just wanted to point something out to you about doing that change. So this is just a snapshot of some of the schools in Southeast. And one thing that we're noting right away is here are 3 schools that are aligned east-west, they're almost on the exact same east-west line, right? So then trying to draw east-west lines between them is, kind of challenging. The other thing that I would say is that if you know the area, there's a big diagonal. The line kind of hides over here, but Foster Road is a diagonal arterial that cuts right down it. So when you talk about don't cross arterials and go east-west, Foster Road kind of messes with that. So I'm not saying that we can't do it, just giving you a sense of some of the complexities that go with that. So tell us a little more about what you're trying to achieve so that we know what to do when we hit these bumps. And then the other thing is that you've got schools that are located really close to arterials, such as Kellogg. On this side of Powell, if we went down a little bit further, you would have Creston on that side of Powell. So those are just some of the complexities that go into trying to decide how to meet your requests, which we are trying really hard to. Every meeting set an amazingly high standard through your dialogue, through the work that you do, and we want to impress you. We really do. We just need your help. Okay, and then the last thing that I wanted to say, and this is going back to your 12-5 meeting, where you asked us to do more modeling that would provide greater relief to Chapman, reduce enrollment at Lincoln, and you didn't want us to create split feeders, and you did ask us to include MLC as a neighborhood school. So I think you've been pretty clear about what you want to achieve there, and maybe we've got enough to just go with that, but if there's any additional clarification that could come out of this, we'd really appreciate it. Okay, so that is just the review. Anything anybody heard that's striking to them that they want to point out right now? Because again, we'd really love to move you into this activity. Okay, and I'm just, yes.
So the creative science piece, when you say we asked, I think our red says we're really not asking that. Right?
So we would take that if we got everything else done on your list, then we'd look at doing that, right?
I just want to make sure you're
So
not
it's
going to go ahead and do that.
That's lower
Okay.
priority.
Low
So
priority.
we are referencing this to help prioritize us to get to.
Because the other one, moving the immersion program to Clark, that's tied to this, right? Clark is not a neighborhood school. Clark is inhabited by a focus option. So I guess you are looking, okay. I just don't want you to take and run with those when we...
No, so the way that you laid down or put up green, yellows, and reds are instructing us a bit, but we understand that those weren't you weren't signing on the dotted line, you were displaying interest at the time. And so that is helping us shape the priorities. Okay, and we think this next activity will help us as well.
So, so Joe?
The next activity is going to go to this criteria sheet.
That's exactly what we're going to do next.
Okay. Well, just on the list that you showed, as a group that was thinking through east, west, and southern and southeast, we did have a principal, I believe, and we had a principal actually on our group, but we had, it was about breaking down some geographicals. When you looked at the patterns, part of the as socioeconomic kind of mixing had these geographical patterns as well. And so could you challenge those and get better SES kind of mix, right? And you're still working within the same part of town. It's not like crazy. And those kind of barrier questions didn't come up. And really, from my point of view, I think we were saying, what if we challenged ourselves to look at it differently? Does it produce a different result? And don't know, and that's what we were asking you to model. On the Woodstock one, you can take that off the list, because all that was just in that same spirit. How do you get more kids into Selwood, I think, or something, I can't remember. But that's the east-west stuff. Is there a way to challenge some of our assumptions? So the only one I really want to talk about is the North Portland ones. There's a lot of specific ideas, and I don't have my data from last meeting, but when you went down the middle schools, it was very difficult to optimize for those middle schools because of just the size, maybe, number of kids. It wasn't working as well as it works in other parts of town. Now, what's that about? Well, it's the geography of our city, the socioeconomic geography of our city that we're asking schools to solve. Well, they're not going to move that. They have to design around it. And so then, for me, the question was, with all these ideas, what if we start with trying to optimize that? Like, what's the best outcome for this very difficult part of town to get right? And you tell us, but these were ideas that I think we came up with. Or that's what I thought I saw.
Sarah?
I'm really struggling with modeling the 7 schools. I don't feel comfortable about where those came up, why those 7. We had a whole bunch of K-8s who asked to stay as K-8s. Some of them are not listed there. We already know what they look like as K-8s. They're in the scenarios already. I'm sensitive to your time, and I'm really not comfortable with why we're picking. It seems kind of random. And
if I could jump in on that one, I think that's why we actually want to do this criteria exercise around.
I don't see that on the criteria sheet.
So if you would be willing to park that question or that concern as one that that we do want, I think that's healthy discussion, and I think that it would be well informed by folks getting a little bit. I mean, we hope this is going to work. That if you really look at what you're trying to achieve, and you show each other what you're trying to achieve, then you can come back and say, so does that help us just pick these 7 schools, or should we pick any schools that fall into that list or the like? Okay, so I think if it's okay, let's go ahead and get started okay, so as you know, there are many criteria. They're called factors in policy and in the administrative directive. There are some things in the values framework. There are some things that have just come up. So in order for us to deliver better scenarios for your consideration, we'd like to know a couple of things. First of all, what are the words that you use? What are your words for defining, like how do you define some of these criteria? And we know that there are words. Sometimes it's like, what's criteria? What's a rationale? Are we using the same words? Are we using your words? It would be helpful to hear as much of that back from you right now as we can. And then we want to know, are there any collective patterns based on how you are actually applying different criteria yourself in your own heads right now? So we're going to ask you to do an exercise that Sarah and I both played with a little bit and both thought it was pretty hard. But you got macaroni and cheese tonight, so we feel like you're ready to do something that's pretty hard. So in this activity, we are going to ask you to look at criteria. A couple of caveats. It's not intended to, it's intended to generate discussion and understanding. It is not intended to produce a one-size-fits-all prioritized list for universal application. We know a lot of this stuff will always be situational, but I think we really believe it will help us if we could just see where people are right now. And there are other questions we could apply it to. There are other criteria you could put on the list. There's a place for you to fill in other if that's important. And if you want to do this at another time with other questions, we can. But let's see how far we get tonight. So you have a handout that I think maybe everybody has found right now. And there are big versions of it up here on the wall. There are 2 questions on the handout, one on one side and one on the other. Would somebody read one of the questions?
It has no number, but I'm going to call it question number 1. How important are certain criteria to you when determining which schools should remain as K-8s?
And there are a list of 9 things. And if we if we left something off, add something to it. Then the next question, who wants to read the next question? It's on the back side. Anybody? So if you flip the paper over to the other side.
How important are these criteria to you in determining which buildings should convert to middle schools? And are they the same?
So there are slightly fewer criteria on that one. Again, if we've left something out, please add it. So this is what we're going to ask you to do, is just to work silently and independently for a few minutes, answering those questions yourself. When you go down the list of criteria, what words are you using to define what that means for you? You have sticky notes available. Note those words on sticky notes. After you've had a few minutes to work by yourself, we're going to ask you to go up to these big sheets of paper. The middle school one is on this side, the K-8 one is on that side. Put your sticky notes up in the box, and then put a dot where you decided your priority is for that particular criteria. No, you're using dots. So the worksheet is to help you go through your thinking for a few minutes by yourself. And then with your worksheet in hand, come up here and put the dots to reflect what's on your worksheet. Try really hard to put what you really thought at first and not what you see other people do. And then if you have additional definitions or language for that criteria, write it on a sticky note and place it up here. And there's a question from Scott.
So the question about convert to middle schools, is that converting from a K-8 to a middle school or a K-8 to a K-5 and or a middle school?
It's really about middle school. It also includes buildings that would open or change in some way to become a middle school.
Okay, so this is about where should middle schools be cited if...
And when you think about that question, how do these criteria fit for you? So we're going to let you work. Jim's going to time keep for us. We're going to check in about...
Check in 5 minutes. So at 7:50, we'll check in with the group.
So you don't have to be done in 5 minutes. We're going to check on where you are. I would think, how does 10 minutes sound? Does 10 minutes sound good for both questions and then getting your things up? 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. We're coming back at 7:55.
So I think Maxine and Scott are wrapping up over here, and I guess I would invite everyone else to maybe take a moment. One thing that happens to prep for this meeting is custodial staff and staff from Enrollment and Transfer Center go around and find 20-some rolly chairs just so that you can pivot and turn from where you're sitting. And they do it for you every meeting, and then we figure out how to get them back to the rooms afterwards. And tonight, it's going to matter, because from where you are, you should be able to pivot and see the results of both of these. But if you want to get up close and you want to get up and stand around them, that's fine too. But if you want to take just 1 minute and take a look at what the result is, side by side over here. Okay, we are going to go side by side over here. Observe your results. Don't lose these stickies. Thank you. So can everybody see? Jason's win.
Thank you. Hi, I'm back. Okay, so I'm just going to do a very peripheral scan of where the dots have landed. So looking at the K-8 sheet first. So the first criteria is ability to offer at least 3 sections per grade level without being overcrowded. And it seems very clear that a majority of the committee members here believed that that criteria was very important. The next criteria is ability to offer at least 2 sections per grade without being overcrowded. One post-it note we've got here that a member is going to go to define the criteria in their own words says, 2 sections or less seems very inequitable in terms of ability to offer a variety of course offerings. And then in terms of the dots, it looks like that there's still a majority that believe that that is very important, but some also say that was both somewhat or not very important here. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the question, I think some people, I'm not sure that people marking important means that they don't agree
Right.
with the one above, and I think it might be, the results may be misleading.
Okay.
It seems that that should be something we should talk about then to make sure we all understand what that means for that to be important.
Okay.
So do we want to continue with the quick summary and then
Not
come
now.
back to it?
Let's do the, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, parking
Yep.
lot. Okay, so the next criteria for which school should remain as a K-8 is ability of nearby schools to have sufficient enrollment without being overcrowded. And this post-it note here, it says, do not maintain K-8s, especially if not large enough for 3 sections, if changing from a K-8 can benefit nearby K-5 middle school clusters, especially for lower SES K-5s. Okay, and so 3, 6, 8, 2, 5. This one, people felt it was very important, with about 5 members saying it was somewhat important. Next criteria for which school should remain a K is having compact boundaries. And then the only post-it note, see here, is as they've defined it as kids can walk to school with friends. This one came down as one person felt it was very important, and then it seems like there was a consensus of somewhat important, and then varying down into not very important. So more towards this half here.
Hey, Jason, process suggestion. So I think on the sticky notes, we're happy to go ahead and get those written up, typed up and sent back so that we can move a little quick. And just so that folks know, we're sending this exercise out to any absent members so that their feedback can be incorporated in the final product.
Okay, next criteria for K-8s, balancing poverty levels across schools. 2, 6, 3. This one was actually close to split, with the majority being of somewhat important here. Next criteria being past disruption experienced by a school community. Clear majority felt that was of somewhat importance. Next one being limiting change for historically underserved students. Kind of along the spectrum, but there's a chunk here that viewed it as very important, with 3 is somewhat and 3 is not very important. A lot of people didn't vote. And then the last criteria for remaining K-8, avoiding split feeder patterns. Majority said that that was somewhat important. Then the last category for this one, last criteria for this being student achievement data, 2, 6, actually kind of split between very important and not very important. Okay. So moving on to determining which school building should convert to middle schools. First criteria being ability to have enrollment of at least 450 students without being overcrowded. Clear majority that criteria was very important to the membership. Next one being whether or not other nearby schools are right-sized. Kind of split between very important and somewhat important, but kind of in the middle right here. Next criteria for that being having compact boundaries. Clear majority said somewhat important. Balancing poverty levels across schools. Actually close to split between very important and somewhat important. The next category being past disruptions experienced by a school community. Seems to be more in the somewhat important category here. Then now we've also got limiting change for historically underserved students. So somewhere in the range between very and somewhat important, but definitely on this end of the spectrum. Then we move down to schools converting to middle schools of the criteria of avoiding split feeder patterns. Consensus blocks on both very important and somewhat important. So definitely in that range, but slightly more voting members for somewhat important. And then lastly, for the criteria of student achievement data, looks like I've got 5 on the very far end for very important, but then also 5 on the other end of not very important with some in the middle.
Committee members, anything leap out at you, having seen what your thoughts are based on 7:55 on a Thursday night?
So as we're going through the process, there are a couple of things that I'm posing it perhaps as a question, but maybe it's really just hidden as a statement. So there are a number of criteria that are clearly in conflict with each other. So, and they're not sorting by, we're not voting consistently on those that may be in conflict. So for example, where there's 2 or 3 sections, depends, are we seeing that as false thresholds, right? If I say 2 or more, does that include 3 or more? Is that a nested circle? Or is it that we're talking about a threshold? So from a modeling perspective, it would be helpful to know like how you're interpreting that and how that plays out. I think the other one is around compact boundaries and SES mix, and those are pretty much, given the structure of the city, that those are very challenging things to both have. Like I'm just concerned that that would make noise in a model because they're going to be in conflict with each other. And then for some of, I guess the last thing I would say, just doing the process, some of these are really about, so I need some clarification about what does it mean by, I think the language is ability of nearby schools that are K-5, nearby schools that are K-8s, nearby schools that are middle schools, nearby schools that are high schools. Which nearby schools are we talking about? Are we talking only about grade bands? I think would be helpful to understand. And then I think the last piece around student achievement data, it's hard to talk about determining which buildings should convert to middle schools based on student achievement data. And I want us to be, I think we need to define that very carefully and thinking about, and I think I think I would like to see a correlation, and I know we started to do this between SES within buildings and the student achievement data. I want to understand what we mean by that a little bit more. I know we started to get there in some of the information that was given to us, but it's not clear to me. I guess just to be very frank, then what tends to happen is that we look at schools that are underperforming in student achievement data, and then we change them a lot. And they tend to be the schools we keep changing, and that's going to be in conflict with one of our other criteria, again.
Michelle.
So I just wanted, Sasha talked about the first two and maybe wondering about how reliable they were and also some of the things Margaret said. So I didn't really look at this as a prioritizing exercise. So I could have put, oh, they're all very important to me. And so I think if you wanted me to choose between which is more important, the boundaries or the diversity, that would have been a slightly different question. Or if you wanted me to say, do I think we should have 2 as a minimum or 3 as a minimum, that's a different question. So I marked very important for 3 and for 2 because more is better, but 2 is important too. So if you're looking at this is to try and tease out what's most important, then maybe we could have limited the number of dots that we were given, or, so I guess that's my caveat, because a lot of them are important, and some of them aren't, but it doesn't give you any idea about the relative importance.
Can we just stay on the 2 versus 3 for a minute? Because, I would just say as an observation, when I look at the result, what I see is that organically, without discussing with each other and maybe with different assumptions of what the right answer is, there are more people who said that meeting 2 sections per grade level was not very important than there were people who said the same thing about 3 sections. So right there, that says to me that even if they're both important, there were more people, like just, there's nothing on the not very important side for 3 sections. And that seems to me an indication that hitting 3 sections per grade level, because we said that would give you the most efficient use of the staff available, maybe it's why, or maybe you have another reason, is resonating with people more than just hitting the 2 section level. Now, that's interpretation, and I'm going to put it out there and see if that generates more clarification.
I think that well, I can say what I thought. I thought that 2 was a subset of 3. Like if we couldn't get 3, we got to at least have 2. I think, and it seems to me that may be the way other people interpreted it. So, clearly the people who if people put that 3 was important and 2 wasn't, then that's not the way they interpreted it.
So there's a problem, because that's how I interpreted it. I went 3, not 2. I did look at this as kind of priorities, because I was trying to get to this. So I don't know where that puts us, but.
Additional clarification then, looking at that question, staff is trying to, we see this is a key question. It actually wasn't up there, and we spent a good long time, and Sarah convinced me. So why don't you say a little more about it then?
So I think I would love for the group to wrestle a little bit more and talk a little bit more about this question, because as you know, that 3 sections per grade, we are limited in the number of buildings that can hold 3 sections per grade. So if you are saying that
particularly for high poverty.
Particularly for higher poverty K-8 schools. So that question actually has a great deal of meaning in terms of which schools can become K-8s. And so I think it's important to have a little bit more discussion about that particular item.
Can I make a process suggestion then? Could we say you only get 1 vote just on the 3 sections, and then let everyone vote, and see, and then that will give you a threshold question about whether or not that is the.
And is the vote, is it a high, medium, or low priority?
Yeah, right.
Okay. You all have cards in front of you.
Would that clarify?
So I think what's being proposed is that because some people may have used the dots differently, so not relative to each other, then for this particular question, when it's really important, if you could follow up with a red, yellow, and green, and then we would do the same thing for the 2 section?
Well, it
just
seems
to
to me
clarify that?
like that there's not an agreement in the room about that that's the right way to clarify it. So maybe my suggestion is not good.
Okay, well, yeah, that's what I was going to say is, you know, if I look at our criteria, one of our top criteria was having equitable offerings for all students. And if we looked at the, across the schools who had lots of opportunities for taking a different language, taking a different level of math, doing all these individualized instructions, those were the schools that had a lot of sections, because therefore you could kids could kind of pursue their own path. And that's, you know, to me that says that the 6 sections is great. 3 sections is, well, if you're going to do it, you better have at least 3 sections. And then when I got down to 2 sections, I put it as not important. I said that's a non-starter. And so that was how I voted on that one, because you get down to 1 or 2 sections and then there are no electives, right? And I think that has lots, you know, there better be an awfully strong countervailing argument as to why there's some other benefit for these kids before I would think we should consider that.
So here's a process suggestion. Having heard this conversation, if there's anybody who believes that they would move their dot based on this conversation to move it somewhere else, we have extra dots and we can just go and do that. Does anyone want to entertain shifting it?
What's the question then? Frame the question again.
So I don't know if it's a different question. So 3 or 2? 3, or so what I've heard is, so it's a minimum of 2 or it's a minimum of 3. Okay, so is a minimum of 2 sections good enough, or is a minimum of 3 sections good enough? And those questions are somewhat relative to each other.
Minimum of 2 sections is good enough. How do you vote on the 2 question?
So the question is, are you looking at that when trying to figure out if a school should be a K-8? You're saying it's important to look at whether it can be at least 2 sections. Is it important to know whether it can be at least 3 sections per grade level? Is one of those more important to you than the other?
Yes.
You've been clear on that. I'm not sure that everyone else has, so, and it's helpful for us.
Sarah, are you willing to frame a question? You're trying to think of it? Putting the pressure on you because I know you're good at this. I feel like and I think we fell into this last time, that this is a moment at the end of the evening where we can either go broad or we can narrow, and I think this is a moment where we can narrow and actually have some really important results from it. So I think how we frame this question and how we then decide who's in, who's out matters. So I'd just to have us pause for a second and really make sure we're asking the right question.
So let me try this. My sense is that some members on this committee want a Deep 6 NEK 8 that has less than 3 sections. Is that fair, or is that too harsh? Okay, then if that's too harsh, and I think you and I are on somewhat, not polar, but different, totally respectful back and forth on it. If we're not going to draw a line there, then we're open to 2 or 3 sections. And this isn't an applause thing. This is trying to figure this out. And I just want to say, you know, the numbers thing is important, and I get that. And we have both some upper income and some lower income K-8s who are pretty passionate about, hey, we got something working here. And it kind of goes back to Margaret's, what's our criteria of got it working mean? And we can't just go by test scores. I don't feel like I'm just speaking for me, have the knowledge to do that kind of evaluation, to say, well, you might feel like it's working, but it ain't working good enough from whatever criteria you want to use, which is why I think we should go forward with 2 scenarios where there's different flexibilities around K-8. And I'll just...
Michelle.
Trying to make this follow. Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before, which is what are you willing to trade off for that compromise in enrollment? And what are your other priorities? And that's a harder exercise to do, and I didn't really do it. So if you want to know what I would give, what I would compromise if it's going to be a 2 sections, but I would get better diversity, I might go for that because that's important to me. The boundaries, and that's another thing that's hard, is because I think the boundaries are important for the younger children, and we didn't talk about the impact on the K-5. All right, I'm not seeing how that fits in necessarily. So it's pretty complicated, and I wish there was a more direct question, like, do you want this or do you want that? Like when you're at the optometrist, do you want this or do you want that? And I can do that.
Jane.
In order for me to respond to the question of 2 versus 3, first I need staff to phrase the question. I need the experts who do the work to phrase the question in order that I can be sure, because in phrasing a question, it makes you understand what you're really asking. It makes you understand the answer you get. So it's not that I think anybody here wants to put pressure on staff, it's that 2 versus 3 to me is a question staff needs to ask so that we can be sure when you guys go into January 9th, you know what the message was leaving this meeting today. And secondly, when it comes down to 2 versus 3, it gets down to, but can the building hold that? And for me, I use the analogy, your house is only so big. You may have had a Christmas party with 100 people, but at the end of the night, do you have a bed for all of them? Do you have a bathroom for all of them? Can you feed them all in the morning? Probably your house was not built for 100 people. So 2 versus 3 is more of a geography question, and then the population. I don't want to vote on this and have it be a universal policy, because to me 2 versus 3 is not a one-size-fits-all.
Margaret, then Jason.
So I'm trying to think about how it was. So I want to make sure I understood what we were asked to do to begin with. So to see each of these in isolation, right, and then to rate them on their own merits. Is that what our original question was? So one by one, if we just looked at this criteria, how important is it? If we just look at this criteria, how important is it? So what I have a hard time with from a modeling perspective, right, is that there is interplay and there's feedback loops in all of these. So it's very difficult for me to say one by one I can go through and say, we're going to take this, this is where I stand on this one. And this is when I know that they are going to, one of them is, if you run the scenarios, one of them is going to drive it. So my gut tells me what's going to drive it are 2 things on whether this is 2 or 3. It is going to be the capacity of the buildings. And it's going to be, I think probably, we have all agreed that 1 is too small. We can take that off the table. And then if you just say if the building capacity can't hold at least 2, then we have a bad fit immediately. But then if you get to this piece about is it 2, is it 3, then there's interplay about the neighborhood, and then it's about the boundaries, and then it's about the SES, and then it's about, all those other things start to play very quickly. The interesting thing is there's not a converse for the middle. There's not a, is it 450 or is it 600? It's 450. So I'm interested to think about why, you know, this is presenting a conundrum, but partly it's because either there's a clear floor to a size of a middle school, and it's an unclear floor for a K-8, which is what the source of the problem is.
So I'm going to hem and haw for 10 seconds to give Jason a chance to sit down. He was chasing down a document.
Well, I don't need 10 seconds, but I appreciate it. So I think for me is, I looked at this particular question from primarily a facilities-driven point of view. Facilities is something we can't change, because I don't know the current state of every building, and I don't know what the cost will be. Two is, while I have personally heard from public testimony and comment from a lot of families and communities that like their K-8 for what they've built in their community, what they've built in their school, those are the only communities we're hearing from. We're not hearing from every K-8 community like Jason Lee and, you know, outer Northeast, for example, what they think. I heard from one student, from what I recall at the testimony at King. So for me, I'm not hearing from every community about whether or not it's good or bad. So in absence of that, I go to what can the buildings physically hold, in large part because what we put in our original framework, which was our ideal number 3, which was environment, which was, in order to enable equitable access to programs, all school facilities should have the appropriate student enrollment, grade configuration, and physical support for programmatic needs that match the size of the facility. That is the framework we voted, the superintendent endorsed, and the board adopted. Facilities conversations, those are the real things that it's very tough to fix and take a lot longer to get in place, because by the time you get your facilities changed to whatever we may recommend more configurations to, we're in that bubble of more, half of or some percentage of that 5,000 student population that's set to grow. So as far as, I looked at this solely from a facilities point of view, where our current state is, as cold as it is, facilities is one thing that is the most, is one of the more important ones, is the toughest to implement and cost the most.
I just want to sum up some of the things that I've heard, because it's actually been really helpful, and I know people wanted the perfect question. I think the perfect question is actually quite quite impossible to write for a question, for something this complicated. So what is important for staff to know is, if there was some sort of consensus among this group that all K-8s must be 3 sections per grade, and really and people didn't have a lot of flexibility around, well, maybe it could be 2 sections if it did these other things. But if it was really just, I want 3 sections per grade, that has huge implications really on our system, and it has huge implications in the sense that we would be moving very largely towards K-5s and middles, because we don't have very many K-8s, especially high poverty K-8s, that can hold 3 sections per grade, period. What I heard from many people, I'm not going to say all people, is that many of you think, yeah, 3 sections would be preferred, but in relation to some of these other factors, I think other things need to be considered along the way. And so I wouldn't just eliminate completely the possibility of a school being a K-8 if it didn't have 3 sections, if in fact it could solve some of the other challenges that we need to be addressed. And so that's what I think I heard from many of the people here, but I would like to test that.
So
that's my process. Part of it. What do we do? It's time, so what are we doing?
So there are a couple of choices here. This group can choose to extend the meeting time if you so desire. Another choice is that we could end right now. I'm interpreting what I think Sarah said, that while the question wasn't perfect, it certainly generated the right level of nuanced discussion and interchange amongst committee members. I don't know if that's enough guidance for them to move forward to bring you something on January 9th. So I noticed they're huddling here. So, Sarah.
So I'm going to go back to my original, what started this, for me, with these 7 schools. I don't see how this helps that. And I still feel really uncomfortable that we randomly picked 7 K-8s to not. So to model that just doesn't feel right. I don't.
So I'm grabbing out your operating protocols to see, so I can tell you. Right, that's what I'm looking up. So we have a motion and a second to extend the meeting by 10 minutes. So what you need is 2/3 of those present to agree. So can we hold up hands or cards to extend for 10 minutes? Green means you agree. It looks like it's almost unanimous. So we have 10 more minutes. Michael has his card up, and the mic's right there.
2 thoughts. One is, I think certainly there are almost no buildings that can do a 3-section K-8, right? So if you say it has to be 3 sections or not, essentially there are no K-8s, or maybe there's 1 left in PPS. Maybe there's 2, all right. And so a great question that Margaret asked me is, if you really think there ought to be at least 3 sections, under what circumstances would you be comfortable with a 2-section or maybe even a 1-section? And I think what I would say is, based on the criteria that we have, our preference is to have a very broad course offering. That's what we consider to be equitable. When we looked at some of these, only have 1 or 2 offerings. You can't get any languages. They don't have band. You can't have 2 sections of math. You can't have higher and lower, all these things. We said that's inequitable. We really want to give kids a variety of choices in middle school or at the 6th or 8th grade. And so are there circumstances where I would be comfortable that we had fewer sections and you didn't give kids all these opportunities? I think that would be kind of a case by case, and I'm not sure that we have all the information. There certainly have been a number of reasons people have given why they think a K-8 model for one reason or another. I mean, one example that I can think of is the Odyssey program, right? If you opt into that, you've said, this is the course offering that I want. I don't need to have 10 different course offerings because I want to be focused on this course offering. So that one, to me, that makes sense, that you don't have to have 3, 4, 5, 6 sections. But for other ones, I think that was the way forward that I propose. Is our baseline is K-5 and middle school for that reason of offering broad course offerings, and that anything that's not a K-5 middle school is a case-by-case basis that shows there's some other educational benefit for the students, not for convenience for parents or anything else, that says it's better for this group of students educationally to have something other than this model.
So we extended at 8:32. We have 7 minutes left. Michelle, Sheila, then Jason.
So I'm just going to be brief. I agree with you, and I think that for me, I would want to know what the conditions are to be this exception to the rule. So I would be probably comfortable making that rule if it was clear how we were going to decide what the exceptions were to the rule. And I don't know. Like, I'm thinking Skyline, personally. Why am I thinking Skyline? Because of its remote location. It seems like an exception to, it seems like an exceptional circumstance based on where its geography. Are there other exceptions? I don't know, but people would have to bring those forth and we would have to discuss them.
Sheila.
So can I make a suggestion off that then?
Yeah, I'll give up my turn because I was actually just trying to get to what she just said. That was what I wanted, was to.
Okay, so this has been really helpful because you're both talking about that core question of what makes a K-8, right? And you're giving us better understanding of what it is you would look for in a K-8 that's smaller than what that preferred size would be. So very helpful. one way for us to move forward then is to make sure that there is space on the 9th for you to talk about that, and really try and define those things more clearly before we create a scenario that has any specific schools remaining as K-8s. So we would defer that. There's an initial list of 7. You've got the schools that are in scenario 1 as K-8s, you've got the scenario 2 K-8s, you've got a suggestion for a different group of K-8s. We would defer doing that modeling work over the next 2 weeks in order to, until we hear back from you more specifically which schools and why we would keep as K-8s. Can you let me know if that seems acceptable, or does that just generate more? So again, we're trying to figure out how to use our time to give you meaningful results. There was a long list of things that you've asked us to do. That one was somewhat in the middle. We've heard that because the criteria around it isn't sort of specific yet or clear yet, what I'm proposing is that we as staff won't do the modeling for that yet. You would come back and talk about what would cause you to make exceptions for smaller K-8s, and then we would build a model that did what you, that kept those schools as K-8s.
Jason.
So on premise, I'm on track with that. So here's where I am at least. I think at the very least, I think there are kind of like 3 voting actions. One is, do folks at the very least agree, 1, that a K-8 can remain if you have 3 sections? Yes or no? That's how my brain is thinking right now. 2 is, knowing the limitation, like that there are some exceptions where 2-section K-8 can be successful, knowing the margins, it gets tighter to run programs, et cetera. But that fits into that conversation, which I completely agree has to happen on the 9th, because that's a big one that impacts a lot more K-8s, and not everyone is here. So I want to be at least give you guys some clear guidance on, is there any factor that where K-8 should exist? Because I don't want to necessarily parking lot this for at least 2 weeks. I'm looking at the votes at the very least and saying 3 sections we know can be doable. The question is 2 sections, and what are the the exceptions to that, and how do you define that? Because I mean, I am also in agreement that this modeling on the 7 K-8s, I fundamentally disagree with that, because I feel like they were arbitrarily picked at the last meeting. I also personally feel like that the reason those were picked that was because you had representation from those communities in the room. So I don't feel like there was a clear standard of the rationale for those being picked. So we need to establish very clear criteria of what is on the table for K-8s and what is not. And I want clear backing from the committee, because that to me feels like if we don't have that, then we're arbitrarily picking schools without a rationale, and that's what historically happened in the community, and that's what has led to the frustration, and I don't want to repeat that.
So we have 3 minutes, and Scott and Sarah were up, and Sheila.
Why don't you go ahead, because my brain just evaporated.
Getting into brain dead time. I appreciate what Jason's saying, but if you model, I don't want you guys to think that, okay, if we have 3-section K-8s, that's good, because I'm thinking the only 2 schools that I know of, maybe 3, that can be that. If all the rest go to K-5s, the 2, Harrison Park and Roseway Heights, cannot stay as K-8s because they will need to become the middle schools. So I worry if we're going to latch on to having the 3-section K-8s, there's not very many buildings that can be 3-section K-8s.
Can I clarify
yeah.
that what we would do is we would focus on some of your other suggestions, which are around improving the middle schools. There were a lot of other suggestions that you've made, and they didn't include keep Roseway Heights a K-8. So we have a lot of other modeling to do. We're not, by deferring, we're not asking you to get hooked on anything about K-8s. We're just deferring any additional modeling that would leave other buildings as K-8s, and we would be making other changes to areas that you've asked for. We would be doing some of the feeder pattern changes. We'd be looking at Tubman. We'd be looking at, you asked us to do a lot of other things. And we would be ready to share that back with you while we give you time to flesh out the K-8 part a little bit more. That's all we're saying. We're not saying we took that as 3-section K-8s or else.
Right, and just to quickly clarify, I'm fine with Sarah. The other thing I would offer, I think, to your point in preparation for the night, the one thing I would actually throw out as an idea for the group to do over break, and I don't want to give the members homework over break, but I mean, if we're going to come up with an exceptions list, like I want people to take 2 weeks to really think through what that means for them in advance. So one thing I would wonder is, like, could folks in the next 2 weeks think through if, you know, what is your criteria for keeping K in relation to what we've seen, facilities, what have you? And if there were a list of schools that you thought that didn't fit those, like what would be the checklist that if you don't fit the whatever main criteria, what is, like, how would you have a community demonstrate their compelling reason for staying at K-8? And then it's very clear across the board. So, I mean, we can talk it through at a meeting, but at the same time, I want members to really think through what that means because that's a tough decision. And I want members to come ready to feel like that they've had a chance to think through independently and find through whatever information they need to engage effectively.
So I notice we're 1 minute over our 10-minute extension.
I agree with that because I was really concerned that without this set of criteria that you wouldn't be able to make much progress on the modeling. However, if we are starting to develop some ideas about that via a Google Doc or something like that, that might help. So I would be happy to weigh in on that over the break.
Now that I remembered what I was going to say, I suggested 2 additional criteria. One is cost benefit, and that's cost both in terms of money for a conversion and in terms of disruption and the ability of this district to manage a process over a 2-year period. If you're converting 12 K-8s versus 8 K-8s, the 8's more manageable. The other thing is, what's the alternative? If I'm a parent at or a staff at a K-8 that I feel like has it together, and if I'm looking at a smaller sized middle school, is it going to be that much better in terms of program offerings compared to what we feel like we have going in our K-8? If it's not significantly better, then that cost benefit thing to me starts to really come into play there. And I like the idea about,
just,
you know,
while we're adding to criteria, one
my
to
allegedly arbitrary list.
Another one to potentially think about, if we're going to have 2-section K-8s, we wouldn't want we wouldn't want to be able to fit students in comfortably. So I'm looking at the list even on here, and there's a couple of schools on here that I think at 2 sections per grade as a K-8 have pretty high facility utilizations and could barely fit them, just on this list that you asked us to model. So that's just something else to think about. So maybe it's not 3 sections per grade, but it's comfortably fit 2 sections per grade, and we lower our threshold for utilization, so it's not 105%. Maybe it drops to 95. I don't know, but like that's just another thing to think about.
So I noticed that we're 3 minutes beyond our 10-minute extension. It's 8:45. All right, I have lots of people pointing at Jane.
I'm not flat out speaking against the cost benefit as being a criteria, but I am speaking with strong reservations because cost should not be a factor in correcting what is not working and what is flat out wrong.
So just to close, I also want to say, like, we really appreciate both the visual work that you did and that it drove you to other places. This was a really important conversation. We're going to look at what you did for middle schools and try and feed back to you in writing what we think it means so that you have time to review that, and we can try and land something around that over this break as well, and before we come back for another work session. Just like we were able to flesh out things here, sometimes you need to be able to dig deeper, and it's harder doing it away from face-to-face, but we've had such great face-to-face for so long this year, maybe it's time for a break. Huh?
All right, we are way over time. Jason.
So last comment being, I just wanted to say Thank you for the membership for sticking it out through this stretch. We're getting close, so with that, thank you all for really moving this work forward, and have a wonderful winter break, and see you all on Saturday, January 9th. Meeting details to be noticed later on.